Hello and welcome to the first episode of Niemietz Answers. In this series, we're going to have a look at some of the most commonly Googled questions on selected issues that the IEA knows a little bit about. And we're going to start with one of my old hobby horses, which is socialism. Let's have a look at the first question here. Is socialism good? Well, that's an easy one. The answer is no. Socialism is terrible. Normally, questions of that type are difficult to answer because, first of all, it depends on what you mean by good. What is your measure of success? And secondly, it depends on what you compare it to. Good relative to what? Because it's all relative, right? But in this case, this is very easy. We only need to look at various self-described socialist projects and compare them to otherwise similar capitalist countries or regions. So the most famous historic example of this was, of course, the comparison between East and West Germany, but that's far from the only one of its kind. Today we could compare North Korea to South Korea, we could compare Cuba to Puerto Rico, we could compare Venezuela to maybe Chile or Uruguay. Or historically again, we could compare Hungary and Czechoslovakia during the Cold War to Austria during the same period. We could compare the Soviet Union to Finland. We could compare Maoist China to Taiwan or Hong Kong in the same period. Or we could compare some of the African examples of the 70s and 80s to some of their more capitalist neighbors. So let's say you compare Mozambique or Angola to Botswana. Whichever examples you choose, you always get the same result, which is that the more capitalist example is always vastly superior on pretty much any measure you care to choose. Whether you're interested in economic outcomes, whether you're interested in social indicators, or whether you're primarily interested in civil liberties and human rights, it doesn't matter which one you choose. It's always the more capitalist example which performs vastly superior to the socialist one. So if we judge socialism by its outcomes, then that's a very easy question to answer. No, socialism is not good. Socialism is absolutely terrible. Let's have a look at the next question. Is socialism the same as communism? Okay, that's a slightly trickier one. For Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the answer was yes. They used both of those words and they used them interchangeably. Their most famous book is, of course, the Communist Manifesto, but there's also a slightly less famous companion book to the Communist Manifesto written by Friedrich Engels in, I think, the 1880s, which was called Socialism, Utopian or Scientific. Now, why did he choose socialism in the book title rather than communism? The answer is there's no particular reason. He just didn't see them as meaningfully different from each other. So for the early Marxists, they definitely were synonyms. That changed slightly in the early 20th century when Lenin slightly rearranged the words. Marx and Engels had not distinguished between socialism and communism, but they had drawn a distinction of a somewhat different kind. They had said that this new society that they had in mind, whether you want to call it socialism or communism, they said that this new society would come in two different stages. The first stage would be a state-run economy. And not just any state, but, in Marxist mythology, a state collectively run by the working class, a worker state, the dictatorship of the proletariat. But they also said that then at some stage, at some point, the state would not be needed at all anymore, because Marx and Engels believed that a state is always an instrument of the ruling class, and the whole point of socialism, of course, was to create a classless society. So once you have a classless society, once you no longer have ruling classes and oppressed classes, then the state is not necessary anymore and it would just disappear. Now, Marx and Engels didn't have different words for those two stages. They just called them the lower stage and the higher stage. Lenin then proceeded to describe the first stage as socialism and the higher stage as communism. So for Lenin, socialism is a state-run economy, whereas communism is the final utopia, an economy or a society which doesn't have a state at all anymore. And that became the standard Marxist usage in the 20th century. And for them, but even then, even for Lenin, socialism and communism were not different ideologies, right? They were just different stages of development within the same system. But when Lenin talked about the ideology, he didn't see a distinction between socialism and communism either. When he was talking about himself or his comrades, then he used both words. He would sometimes call himself a socialist, sometimes call himself a communist, and for no apparent reason. It's not that he used one word in one context and the other word in a different context. He just used them interchangeably as long as he was talking about the ideology. And that remains the Marxist usage until this day. If you're talking to orthodox Marxists, that is still the case. Self-described communists would not have a problem with being called socialists. If you ask a communist, let's say somebody from the Communist Party of Britain or some of our counterparts at Novara Media, if you ask them, would you be comfortable with the label socialist? They would of course all say yes. Every communist would also be happy with the label socialist. However, nowadays that doesn't automatically work in reverse. Not every socialist would automatically accept the label communist as well. And that is not so much because they're fundamentally different ideologies now. It's more because what has changed is the connotation of the words. At least in Britain, to most people's ears, the word communism just sounds a lot more radical than the word socialism. If you call yourself a socialist, that doesn't sound particularly controversial, whereas if you call yourself a communist, that might be a little more on the controversial side. So therefore, what has changed in the meantime is not so much that they have become different ideologies, but that the connotations of the words have changed. Socialism has become mellower and more broad-based and more diffuse, whereas communism has retained the old meaning. So therefore, it simply, whether there's synonyms depends simply on who you are talking to. If you're talking to an orthodox Marxist, then yes, you can use them synonymously. Whereas if you're talking to a more diffuse kind of socialist, somebody who uses socialism more in the sense of a set of values or a set of policies, then you can no longer automatically assume that it's the same as communism. So it simply depends on who you're talking to. However, if we're talking about a revival of socialism today, and it clearly has been a revival of socialism, then we're talking about a revival of actual Marxism. We're not talking about people who just misuse the word. And therefore, I think in the current context, it is absolutely justifiable to use socialism and communism more or less interchangeably, more or less synonymously, because a lot of the self-described socialists today do that as well. So if it works for them, it should also work for us. Let's have a look at the next one. Is socialism democratic? Well, that was always the idea. The idea was that if you have public ownership of the means of production, if the people as a whole control their economy, then that means you would get a democratically run economy, a democratically run, an economy run for the benefit of the people and controlled in a democratic way. It's just that it never works that way in practice, and there's a good reason for that. There is just no feasible mechanism through which a population like the British one, 65 million people, can meaningfully democratically run their economy. So if you have a state-run car factory or a state-run airline company, then yes, in theory, you could say you own the 65th millionth part of that, but how much control does that give you? What does that really mean in practice? Just think about the already nationalized industries that we already have, or public sector organizations in general. The Land Valuation Office is of course publicly owned, but do you feel that you have a meaningful amount of control over it? Do you feel that it is somehow truly yours in a meaningful sense? I guess not. So therefore, socialism has always been democratic in theory through collective ownership, but it just doesn't mean much in practice. Next question. Is socialism an ideology? Well, it's an ideology, yes, but it's also an economic system. So that's an easy one. Next question. Is socialism authoritarian? Definitely yes. It was never supposed to be authoritarian. But the trouble is, in a socialist economy, you just always have a massive concentration of power automatically. No matter how, even if it could somehow be made to work in a democratic fashion, that would still be an authoritarian democratic state. Because what happens in a socialist economy is that the state becomes a monopolist for almost everything, or a near monopolist. The state becomes the sole supplier of most goods and services. The state becomes the biggest employer, the biggest landlord, the biggest credit agency. So the state just acquires a massive amount of power, and even if you could somehow control that power democratically, it would still be authoritarian. It may then broadly align with the wishes of 50% plus one of the population, but if you are in the minority, then under socialism you have nowhere else to go, and that would be true even if it were perfectly democratic. So yes, in practice, socialism is definitely authoritarian because it inevitably leads to a massive concentration of power. Next question. Is socialism still relevant today? Well, that depends on what you mean by relevant. If by relevant you mean, does socialism have any answers for the problems of today? Then the answer is no. Socialism is a non-solution. There is none of the big problems of our times that could be solved through socialism. In that sense, it is not relevant, but in that sense, it would never have been relevant. Socialism has never solved any problems, so in an ideal world, it would never have been relevant. But if by relevant you mean, is it still part of mainstream political debates? Is it a popular ideology? Is it an ideology that even if you disagree with it, you have to engage with? Then the answer is unfortunately yes, because socialism is extremely popular, especially among younger people. Over the past 7 or 8 years or so, socialism has become extremely fashionable again. And in that sense, socialism is relevant simply because it is part of the mainstream debate. And it's an ideology which even those of us who completely disagree with it, we still have to engage with it. We have to reckon with it because it is a force to be reckoned with. We cannot ignore it. Next question. Is socialism and Marxism the same? Well, there are non-Marxist versions of socialism, and there have always been, such as anarcho-communism. The thing is just that those are fairly niche ideologies, and if we're talking about a socialism revival today, again, as I alluded to before, then we are talking about socialism in the Marxist sense. So they're not strictly speaking the same. They're not. There's not a perfect overlap here, but for all intents and purposes, you can treat them synonymously because the vast majority of high-profile socialists would also describe themselves as Marxists and vice versa. So yes, you can treat them as more as the same thing for all practical purposes. Next question: is socialism utopian? Well, again, that depends on what you mean by that. If somebody just wants to recreate one of the socialist systems that we've already seen in practice, let's say somebody wants to recreate the Cuban or the Venezuelan system, then that would not be utopian, because that's something which already exists and which you could just copy. It's just that the vast majority of modern day socialists would say that that is not what they want to do. They would say that isn't really socialism, that is fake socialism, they just use the word but they don't mean it. And they would say their version of socialism would somehow be completely different. So that's the old cliche that socialism has just never really been tried. And in that sense, yes, it very much is utopian, because socialists of that variety, of the real socialism has never been tried variety, they distance themselves from all the previous and current examples of socialism in practice. It's just that they all fail to spell out what exactly they want to do differently. And I would say that is exactly what being a utopian means. So yes, socialism is very much utopian. And a final question, is socialism better than capitalism? Well, I've sort of answered that already with the first one. Is socialism good? The answer is definitely no. Socialism is terrible. And that was it. And thank you for watching.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.